nerds, what's up? Today I want to talk about magic and technology and how, for some reason, they seem to be at odds with each other. There are countless posts on the internet of unpublished authors bemoaning how to make magic and technology work together. Can they coexist? And if they do exist together, how? Why do we tend to view fantasy stories as happening in a very specific medieval time period? When does the inclusion of technology with magic make it sci-fi? These are the kind of questions I want to discuss today, and as usual, this video isn't here to provide a definitive answer, but rather to start a discussion with you guys on how we define the fantasy and sci-fi genres and what it means to have magic and technology together. We'll get into it after the jump. The first thing we have to start with is defining what we actually mean by the word technology. Because technically, most fantasy we read does have technology in it, just not maybe the way we use the word in modern times. Technically, historians consider the first technology to be tools created millions of years ago, like hammers or knives. We have the technology of fire, and then of clay, bricks, woven clothing, and the wheel. Then irrigation, sailing iron, gunpowder, compasses, the mechanical clock. Then we sort of stop. That's the technology we are used to seeing in fantasy novels. As technology progressed after that, to steam engines and printing and photography, these kind of technological advances only appear in fantasy we usually specifically call out as steampunk or urban fantasies. But beyond that, I'm talking about even extremely modern tech. I'm talking computers, cell phones, internet. Or even if we want to go before the 80s or late 70s, I'm talking cars, airplanes, things like that. So today when I'm talking about magic and technology coexisting together, what I'm really talking about is what we're going to consider very modern technology, or technologies from the 1950s onwards. One thing that might be difficult to overcome when we're talking about magic and technology is the fine, often indiscernible line between the fantasy and sci-fi genres when it comes to technology. Now let me be clear, I personally think fantasy and sci-fi are very different genres, even if they both fall under the speculative fiction category. They do get lumped together a lot, but I think they accomplish very different things and tend to have different tones. So let's talk briefly about the definition of these genres. I really like the Britannica's definition of this because it includes some important things. When we look at science fiction, it says that it's a form of fiction that deals principally with the impact of actual or imagined science upon society or individuals. While fantasy is imaginative fiction dependent for effect on strangeness of settings, such as other worlds at times, and characters. The elements I want to highlight here is that in science fiction, it particularly talks about how it usually examines the effect on society of real or imagined technology. And I feel like that's where we really get the line between fantasy and sci-fi. It's not because fantasy can't look at societal effects, of course it does, but it tends not to focus on technological things influencing society. Whereas in sci-fi, that's a lot of our primary focus. Now, I will admit I am much more versed in fantasy than sci-fi, but all the sci-fi, at least I have personally read, that has held true. Now, we can clearly see how these overlap. Now, the most famous of these is probably Star Wars, which is usually called a sci-fantasy. What's interesting about Star Wars as a property is that it definitely deals in things that we feel science fiction deals in. Space travel. For some reason, space travel is just like always science fiction. We just feel it in our hearts. But it also deals with the Force, which is clearly a magical element. Additionally, it's about a galaxy that's far away a long time ago. It's not in the future, which I do think also gives like a distinctly different feel than a typical sci-fi. Also, I would argue that the purpose of Star Wars is not to talk about how technology affects or influences society. So I think the sci-fi nature of Star Wars is mostly because it takes place in a place that has technology we don't have, which makes it feel sci-fi. But truly, Star Wars has many more fantasy elements, I'd argue, than science fiction elements. Basically, what I'm trying to say is I think a lot of what our expectations and ideas about what sci-fi and fantasy are do indeed influence how we categorize things. So let's talk about why do we always kind of associate fantasy with a specific past time and place. Now, I've already done an entire video on the history of Western fantasy, and if you are interested in that, you can watch it here. So I won't rehash all of those details, but I do think it's important to know that once we see the history of the modern fantasy genre, we can see how maybe it still influences our idea of fantasy today. Fantasy, mythology, and of course Tolkien have given us roots of what we think the definition of the genre is. I think somehow, sometimes without even knowing or realizing we're doing it, we have tied fantasy with a certain feeling. And even if we move out of medieval Europe, which I think more currently we are trying to move away from the idea that fantasy is just medieval Europe, even when we go to other settings, it still often takes place much before modern technology. We're still kind of in that medieval space. I think that sometimes it can feel like fantasy needs to match a certain aesthetic, and the best example I can give of this, even though it is not an adult fantasy, is Harry Potter. Now, to be clear, I am a giant Harry Potter fan. I love the series, I love the Wizarding World, so what I'm about to say isn't necessarily like a criticism against Harry Potter, it's just an observation. At some point when you think about the Wizarding World, you have to realize that a lot of it is about the vibe. It's about aesthetics. Like, yes, I know in the fourth book we get the line that Muggle technology goes haywire around wizards and magic, and that's kind of like a cover for why they don't have modern technology. But at some point you have to ask, is a ballpoint pen really technology? Is a ballpoint pen really something that would be affected by magic in the air? Or is it just that a quill and ink and parchment is vibes, is aesthetic? And that's what makes the Wizarding World fun. Can we really say a Patronus or an owl, the former of which is very advanced magic that can't be done till way later in life, and the latter one that has got to be at least as slow as regular snail mail in the Muggle world, is better than a cell phone? Again, I know that technically it wouldn't work in the magic world, but you'd think they'd come up with like a magic cell phone maybe? Again, vibes. Owls and Patronuses, way more fun. It might be a little silly, I just think that's a nice, small, fun example of how aesthetics can really play in to how we view fantasy and give us the fun fantasy vibes that we're going there for. Now, of course, the fantasy genre is expanding every day, and I think especially in the last decade or two, we've really seen a change in the fantasy genre that has made it a lot more broader of a genre. I think there are definitely ways to blend the two that can make it feel like fantasy and not necessarily a futuristic sci-fi.
I don't think I talked enough about urban fantasy here, which is clearly an exception. As a subgenre, it's been doing tech with magic for a while now. I think I perhaps don't think of it in these scenarios because I'm thinking more of a classic fantasy or a higher fantasy, which has a larger scope than many of the urban fantasies I've seen or read. Now, before you come for me, yes, I realize I only read one Dresden Files book, so perhaps that gets much, much bigger in scope as it goes on. But I'd be interested to hear from people who love urban fantasy and read a lot about it on how they feel about this topic. Does every story with tech automatically become urban fantasy? Does it have to be that way? Let me know.
One thing I think is vital if you want to blend magic and modern technology is giving severe limitations to your magical abilities. If the magic is only available to a small group of people, or the outcomes of the magic are extremely limited, unlike the more anything goes magic that we might see in Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, I think it's easier to understand why in a world technology would still begin to exist or develop. A greater, newer example of this, I think, would be Fonda Lee's Greenbone Saga. The Greenbone Saga is firmly in the fantasy genre. You really can't make any argument for it being anything other than fantasy, yet there are cars and telephones. It all feels very vaguely 1960s or 1970s, although notably Lee herself has been unwilling to specify a specific time period outside of the latter half of the 20th century. I think it's much more modern in a fantasy setting than we are used to seeing, and I think it works because there are extreme limitations on what Jade can do. First, Jade can only be used by a specific small section of the population, and when you use it, it has very specific uses that don't take the place of technology, and no reason why it would limit its continual growth. In this way, I think it's a great example about how limiting magic and its uses on the people who have it make it much more easy for magic and technology to exist in a world that is firmly in the fantasy genre. I do think another interesting author to bring up here is Brandon Sanderson. Now, if you're not a Brandon Sanderson fan, you may not know this, but he is planning to bring his adult series that are all connected in the Cosmere from basically medieval fantasy all the way up into space age. Space travel. Now, the best one to look at this specifically is his Mistborn series, which goes through different eras. So our first Mistborn trilogy, which is contained, is very medieval fantasy, while the second era is up to cars and trains and guns. And as the eras continue, 3, 4, I don't know, there might be an extra one, we're eventually going to get to era 4 where there is a space age travel. This has brought the same world, the same planet with magic all the way through those different levels. Now, there are two interesting things here. Again, the magic system on the planet that Mistborn takes place in is limited. Only certain people have it, and over time it's been diluted. So because of that, we can see how technology would naturally advance. The second interesting thing is, will other eras of Mistborn not be considered fantasy anymore? Will they start be considered sci-fi? And it'll be very interesting to see when that switchover takes place as it happens. At some point, what I think is interesting is it does seem to be a limit that you can't have something considered fantasy if it goes into future technology. I think based on our own definitions and kind of how we feel about the fantasy and sci-fi genre, you probably can only have a fantasy novel that comes up to current technology. I think the minute you go over into the future, we just kind of classify it as sci-fi. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Anyways, the point. Is there ever a point to my videos I make like this? Jury is out. But I do think fantasy and modern technology can coexist. I think it's difficult. I think you have to overcome our preconceived notions of what the fantasy genre is. I think personally that you need to have limitations on your magic, so it makes sense that technology would exist. I think there are a lot of fantasy novels that could have modern technology without ruining their fantasy elements, but again, it kind of goes back to the vibes. I do think fantasy is changing. I've said that before. I think we're getting a lot more diversity in the kind of stories that we're telling, and it'll be interesting to see how the genre continues to evolve. I would love to know your thoughts on some key points of this. What do you think about magic and technology existing? What do you think about the lines between fantasy and sci-fi? Does it matter? What do you think about how I define them? Do you think limitations to a magic system is vital for magic to go into modern technology? Or can you think of examples where magic was unlimited and technology still exists? Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments below. I always want to hear from you. And as always, if you like these kind of deep dive videos, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.